The Brimstone Tavern is not your ordinary tavern. Our customers are that of another world. You know, monsters, cryptids and ghosts alike all come to the tavern for a Bloody Mary or scotch with eyeballs. Some even come to the tavern just to converse with the other patrons, although Jimmy doesn't particularly like it when they loiter around. Yeah, Jimmy's the owner of the tavern, a man of few words and a few missing limbs. He had his grace of monsters when he was just 14. He and his father went on a week hunting trip when a blizzard rolled in, trapped him in their cabin. With only a week worth of food, Jimmy's father hacked off his right arm and left leg. The old man could barely believe his luck when the search and rescue came to his aid, when a Wendigo possessed his father. It's a tale he likes to tell all of his patrons, all of whom would congratulate him on his survival and throw jokes at him every once in a while. Like any other night, I made my way into the tavern through the back door and clocked in just as Jake clocked out. We passed each other and gave a nod of acknowledgement before we parted ways. That was until Jake stopped me at the door.
Mr. Clark would be here around 11.
And with that, I walked out the back of the bar and started to serve drinks. On some occasions, some of the patrons would call ahead of time and tell of their arrival. We only do this for the sake of other patrons. You know, not all monsters, cryptids and ghosts get along. The rest of my shift was uneventful, which is good. That was until I smelled the distinct smell of swamp water and something rotten. Right on time, Mr. Clark entered the tavern. His yellow, glowing eyes moved about the faces. His green skin glistened under the light as he walked up to the bar, sat down on the stool and hunched over the table. Mr. Clark, how's it been? I asked, as I prepared as usual. A scotch with human eyeballs. Clark grunted. His gills shifted. I handed him a wet towel to keep himself hydrated.
Another group of snooty teens stumbled into my swamp. But I took care of them.
And he flashed his sharp, yellow-stained teeth at me and slammed his drink. Tapped his glass and I prepared another one for him.
Can you believe it? Some nosy teens that want to prove they're brave enough to mess with me. Ha!
Clark barked out a laugh that made me shudder. I can't imagine what he'd done to those teens. Correction. I can imagine what he did, but I don't want to. That's the catch to this job. You get exposed to the dark and macabre deeds they do to us humans. And once they down enough alcohol that would kill any human, they'll tell you their stories with great detail. Not only that, but I have to make sure everyone is not trying to cause trouble. I watched as Clark popped an eyeball into his mouth and bit down. The eyeball popped in his mouth and some of the fluid went on my shirt sleeve. He chuckled and turned to the redhead next to him. She sipped her Bloody Mary casually and avoided trying to make any eye contact with the swamp monster next to her.
Say, have you vampires ever tried a human heart before?
He asked the vampire, who rolled her eyes and turned to him with a smile.
Why, yes, but it can be messy.
Clark laughed and asked for another scotch. I poured him his drink and went down the bar to tend to another patron, a werewolf named Tom. He sneered at the redhead but kept his mouth shut, unless he wanted to tangle with a vampire in his human form.
All vampires think they're too good,
he mumbled, as he took the pitcher of beer over to his group of friends. They were all huddled in a booth in the dark corner of the tavern. I shook my head and returned to Clark, who had now started to bug the pale and skinny old man sat next to him. The old man scarfed down his third plate of organs and ordered another plate. All the while he listened to Clark's tale of the late teens.
Their bodies are at the bottom of the swamp right now. I can't wait to get back and tear into them.
Clark stated, as he licked his now chapped lips. I handed him another wet towel and he wiped himself down before he asked for another drink. I just emptied the rest of the scotch and grabbed another bottle from the back. When I came back, it was complete chaos, as Clark and the old man fought on the floor of the tavern. I cursed under my breath and set the bottle down before I went to the front of the bar and tried to stop the fight. Hint the word tried. The two of them were covered in human organs and had large gashes on their torsos, forearms and face. Clark let out a snarl and tackled the old man to the floor. They struck each other with blow after blow before a loud bang interrupted the fight. A bullet hole right next to their bodies. I looked behind me to find Jimmy with his shotgun in hand. I motioned for the two to stand up with the barrel of the gun and kicked him out of the tavern. I stood there stunned and afraid that I'd lose my job. Jimmy then reared on me and pulled me to the back of the tavern and sat me down. "What the hell?" he shouted as he slammed the shotgun onto his desk, sent papers flying to the floor. I went to the back to get another bottle of scotch. Clark seemed like he was in good spirits, so I thought I could leave him for a second. Didn't know a fight would break out. And Jimmy shook his head and rubbed his left temple with his left hand, his prosthetic hanging loosely by his side. "What did I tell you?" "Not to leave the bar." "And you did exactly what I told you not to do," he snapped. I looked to the ground and avoided looking into his eyes. I spent the rest of my shift in the kitchen while Stacy took care of the patrons. I also had to pay for the broken cutlery, bottles, and clean the red and blue blood off the wooden floors. Took a good minute to get all the blood out, but when I was done, my shift was already over. I clocked out and walked to my car, but I was stopped by a dark shadow that walked out from behind my car. That was the old man from earlier. His wounds were still bleeding, but he didn't seem to care or notice as he walked around my car to stand in front of me. His gaunt face was covered in deep scratches.
"I didn't get to finish my meal,"
he stated as he took a step closer to me. Now I took a step back.
"I'm just so hungry."
Saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth and down to his chin. "Look, why don't I head back inside and get you a to-go bag?" I said, as I slowly started to make my way to the back door, the old man's eyes never leaving my own. When I looked away to grab the handle, well, that was the worst mistake I could have made. Because as soon as I broke eye contact with the man, he lunged at me, tackled me to the ground. He held my arms down with a strength I didn't know he had. He licked his lips and leaned down with his mouth wide open. I could feel his hot breath on my neck. And we both heard the sound of a gun cocking. Jimmy pointed the barrel of the gun to the man's head, told him to back off. The guy lifted his hands up and got off me. He backpedaled a few feet before he stopped and cracked a smile.
"I was only teasing."
The man spoke with a sickly sweet voice. Jimmy grunted and mentioned for the man to leave, and so he did. But not before he looked at me and smirked. "Wendigos. Never know when they'll attack," Jimmy muttered. He helped me up off the ground and patted me back. "Why don't you take tomorrow off? Jake can cover your shift." I thanked him before getting in my car and driving the hell out of there. I had to park on the shoulder of the road to cry. I was almost killed. I thought as sobs racked through my body. Wendigos are the worst customers to have. So last time, I told you about me running with a Wendigo. Well, this time I got another experience. one that caused all sorts of problems for Jimmy, myself, and the other patrons. You know, it's not uncommon to have customers that travel halfway across the world to come to our tavern. But usually they call ahead of time to warn us of their arrival, since we don't have all the information concerning all monsters, cryptids and ghosts. After my day off, I went back to work with a fresh mind and a bit more cautious than last time. Because of the incident, Jimmy had hired another bartender, who I had to train. His name was Finn, and was a lanky boy with flaming red hair and freckles that dotted his face. And he too also had an encounter with an otherworldly being. He never told me which monster he'd run into, so I didn't press him for the details. The only thing that gave me a vague idea of what kind of beast he'd run into was 4 long scars on each of his forearms and neck. It could have possibly been a werewolf, a grim, or anything with sharp claws. But something told me it was a werewolf, just by Finn's reaction when a werewolf had entered the building. Tom gave me a quick nod of acknowledgement before he went to his usual booth in the far right corner of the tavern. A few more werewolves joined him, all of which entered the tavern in their wolf form. I placed out a lavender candle and lit it, something Jimmy had learned over the years. Lavender doesn't just calm humans, it can also calm monsters. There was a group of vampires on the other side of the tavern. The Chupacabra sat on a stool at the bar, sipping on a pure blood mocktail. The Jersey Devil chilled in the farthest top left corner booth, and many more all conversed and sipped their drinks. I smiled proudly, like a father would smile at his son after a home run. Finn nervously served a hag a plate of raw liver and kidneys. Her rattly breath can be heard underneath her balaclava. She thanked him and went to find a seat. I taught Finn how to make a scotch with eyeballs, a Bloody Mary, a Bloody Martini, and other drinks. It took him a while to figure out the right amount of blood to alcohol ratio. Most of the patrons were in good spirits, so they didn't mind the difference in ratios, while a few of them returned and requested me to make their next drink. I patted Finn on the back and told him that it was alright to make mistakes. The boy nodded his head, continued to serve drinks, while I delivered food to the other patrons. I had to take the plate of kidneys and liver back to the kitchen for Stacy to cut them up for the hag. And that's when Jimmy poked his head out of the office and called me in. You got this? I turned to ask Finn, but he was already busy with another customer. I smiled and left the bar, headed into Jimmy's office. Took a seat on one of the leather chairs and waited for Jimmy to finish up on the phone.
We've got a special patron coming in tonight, although they didn't specify their species.
Jimmy stated as soon as he put the phone back onto its receiver. We're not letting them in, are we? I asked incredulously. Jimmy pursed his lips and sighed.
Money is money.
But we don't even know their species. What if they have a terrible relationship with one of the other patrons? What if they prey on another monster? What if...
That's enough. I knew the risks when I agreed to let them come here.
Jimmy stared me down. I closed my mouth and didn't utter another word afterwards. Once I left his office, I felt an uneasy feeling settle in the pit of my stomach that made it churn. I felt sick with anxiety. I've become close to most of the patrons here. I don't want anything bad to happen to them. A million what-ifs bounced around inside my head as I continued to serve the customers. It was near 4 in the morning when the tavern door opened to reveal a snake humanoid being with snakes for hair and big bulging yellow eyes. And their tongue flicked from their mouth, filled with needle-sharp teeth. One of the patrons looked directly into its eyes and immediately turned to stone. the whole tavern turned into chaos, as all of the patrons tried to shield their eyes. I looked over to see our new bartender had turned into a grey stone statue. I closed my eyes and I could hear her slither up to the bar.
My name is Theno, daughter of Echidna and Typhon.
And I didn't need to hear any more to figure out what she was. We had a Gorgon on our hands. "What would you like?" I asked. All the while I still had my eyes closed. Steno hummed and I could hear her drum her long nails on top of the bar as she looked at the drink menu.
A Malibu Sunsets,
she hissed out. I turned around and I was able to finally open my eyes. Started to get her drink ready just as Jimmy walked out of his office. He looked at me, and then to the statue of Finn. His eyes showed remorse and guilt, but he knew immediately who we were dealing with. He went back into his office, probably to call the cleaning services that deal with monsters. Once I was done making her drink, I cautiously placed the drink in front of her. And I could hear her sip her drink and let out a sigh.
it's great to have a place to unwind.
And she laughed and asked for another Malibu Sunset. I prepared her drink right away and wondered when she would leave. Another 19 Malibu Sunsets later, and Steno slithered out of the tavern, leaving a dozen of our patrons petrified. Gorgons cause all sorts of problems for everyone. Well, it took a while to find more help, and to reinforce the call before you arrive policy to avoid further tragedies. Now, not many patrons and new customers enjoyed the reinforced policy, since some of them don't have the equipment to notify us beforehand. Not all ghouls, ghosts and monsters have cell phones, you know.
Hey, how's it going?
An older gentleman with a wrinkled face called out to me from the front of the tavern. Good actually, I mumbled back, as I carried a body bag into the kitchen, where Stacey had just finished prepping. I slammed the bag onto the table and went out back to pay the shady delivery guy before I returned to help cut up the corpse. I watched as Damien shuffled about behind the bar with a bottle of pig blood in his hand, and watched him closely as he placed the bottle next to the human blood. Damien, can you keep those two separate? Don't want to accidentally mix up the two. You do not want to deal with an angry customer on your first day. Damien thanked me and moved the pig blood and placed it next to the goat blood. Wouldn't matter if we accidentally mixed the two. Not all of the monsters can tell the difference between them. Well, unless they're vampires. But we don't have to worry too much about them ordering a blood substitute, and they prefer human blood over pig and goat blood anyways. I stood behind the bar, serving drinks and food to our customers, and suddenly a concoction of shouts and yelps erupted from the werewolves booth. I made sure Damien knew what he was doing before I left my station to see what all the commotion was about. When I walked up to their booth, everyone grew quiet and moved aside to show a very drunken Tom. He laid across the table and had knocked over everyone's drinks and food. His head bobbed around slightly as he tried to look up at me. I sighed and helped the poor guy up to his feet and allowed his friends to walk him home. It's not every day we have to deal with extremely drunk ghouls and monsters. Most of them know how to pace themselves. I guess Tom had something on his mind, or maybe someone had challenged him to a drinking game. Who knows how it happened? Who cares? Just as long as they get him home safely. Mr. Clark walked through the door when I reached my station. He had an aura of awkwardness to him as he skulked his way up to the bar. Took a seat next to the same red-headed vampire and ordered the scotch with 2 human eyeballs. Candace, the redhead, sneered at Clark before she got up and left the tavern. I could hear her heels fade into the distance as I prepared another drink for a gentleman dressed in an oversized trench coat. Clark ignored the rude gesture and continued to leisurely drink his glass of scotch. Hey, Damien, this is Clark, one of the regulars here. Clark, this is Damien. I introduced the two, who both gave a nod of acknowledgement before they went back to their previous tasks at hand. I carefully watched as Damien prepared a Bloody Mary for a very young-looking vampire. I was unsure if they were even allowed to drink, but, you never can tell with the vampires. The rest of the evening went by pretty smoothly and without incidents, just how Jimmy likes it. That was until I noticed an alarming scent of iron. The air felt electrified and the noise in the tavern seemed muffled to me. I gripped the bar and hung my head in my hand. I felt as if all the energy in me was sucked out.
You okay there?
Clark's muffled voice asked as static slowly crept across my vision. I felt lightheaded and everything seemed to move in slow motion. The world seemed to tilt. And then, just darkness. And I felt my body collapse to the hard wooden floor. I laid there for a few seconds before my vision returned. Damien had shuffled over to me and was now kneeling next to me with a concerned look on his face. But there was something else, like fear.
You alright?
I pushed myself up off the floor and looked up to see Clark looking down on me over the bar. Yeah, I'm alright. I was just a little lightheaded. Pulled myself up to my feet and looked around to see everyone had stopped what they were doing to stare at me. I smiled awkwardly and gave him a small wave of assurance that I was indeed okay. During my fainting spell, the culprit who caused the whole scene walked into the tavern. His hooves beat against the wooden floorboards. His horns nearly scraped the ceiling, and his yellow eyes strained on me. I couldn't tell if he was smirking or snarling due to his head being a goat's head. He sat down and looked at Damien before he ordered. It was hard to understand him because he just bleated like a fucking goat. And we just waved our hand all over the liquor bottles until he snorted. And I took that as a yes. Started to make a strong concoction of liquor. Vodka, peppermint schnapps, gin, and then human blood. I handed the goat man his strange combination and watched as he chugged the whole thing in one drink. Slammed the glass down and demanded another. And another. And another. I catered to our new customer as Damien tended to the rest. I felt nauseous and weak. I was so disoriented that I accidentally grabbed the wrong bottle of blood and added it into the goat man's drink. I watched as he chugged it and then spat it all over me face. I yelped as the alcohol burned me eyes and nose. I could hear a session of bleats and grunts as a chair fell to the floor. I just cowered behind the bar and tried to get me vision back. I then felt a massive hand grip my shirt and lift me off the ground. Before I knew it, I could barely breathe as my back slammed into the farthest wall of the tavern. I could hear a crack and a sharp pain shot up from my tailbone when I landed harshly on the floor. Blind, incapacitated and afraid, I tried to find something to hide behind, but the tavern had cleared out. There was no one. I felt a harsh kick to my stomach. It nearly made me vomit. I prepared for another blow when a shrill shriek assaulted my ears. I sat in Jimmy's office as we waited for the exorcist to arrive. We needed to forcefully drive Goatman out of the tavern. Who knew some salt could save my life? As Halloween comes closer, the number of customers have dwindled. Now, for the better, too. You don't want to meet any of the patrons out of the workplace. Our protection policy doesn't pertain to outside the tavern. As I drove to the secluded area of the tavern, I couldn't help but think back to my run-in with the Wendigo and the Goat Man. Those two will definitely be a problem outside of work. If they find me, that is. You see, everything about the staff members' private lives is kept confidential in order to protect them outside of work, you know. So, if I were to run into any of them, well, I'm fair game. I pushed those thoughts to the back of my head, though, as I pulled into the employees' parking lot behind the tavern. Jake stood outside with a lit cigarette in his mouth. I greeted him and walked inside to find the tavern nearly empty. Only a few patrons here and there. "Hey, Slick, how's it going?" Damien asked, as soon as I walked up to the bar. He leaned against the bar with a toothpick in between his index and thumb. I watched as he picked at something between his teeth with the toothpick. Going alright," I said, as I rolled up my sleeves.
You know, Stacy needs some help in the kitchen. Got another body to cut up and put away. I would help, but I need to man the bar."
Damien jutted his thumb over his shoulder. I looked back into the kitchen and found Stacy struggling to chop through the bone. I then looked at the tavern before I decided it was okay to leave Damien alone for a bit. Walked to the back of the kitchen. Stacy held the meat cleaver high above her head and, with all of her strength, brought the blade down. There was a metallic clang as the cleaver managed to cut through the ligament and bone. She wiped her brow and sighed as she went onto the shoulder. "Hey, want some help?" As she looked up and smiled before she gestured to the already mangled body.
Yeah, I need some help getting through the bone.
After we packaged the body parts away into the walk-in freezer, I walked back out to the bar to find a mysterious man seated there. He wore a long, oversized coat with a hat that covered the upper half of his face. He drummed his long nails against the top of the bar, and his yellow rat-like teeth clicked. "Can I help you?"
Yes, I would like a Bloody Mary. Human blood, please.
And the stranger squeaked out. He shivered underneath the thick winter coat, and his nose twitched as he sniffed the air. I took a glance at him every once in a while, trying to figure out what type of monster he was. It was something I've never seen before. It's a rarity to meet new monsters. I passed him his drink and went to help another patron down the bar. The man hadn't touched his drink, but instead continued to look around the tavern. His nose twitched every once in a while, and his hand would reach for his pocket. Clearly he's up to something. I let Damien know about the man's odd behaviour and told him to keep a close eye on him. Went to the back of the tavern for a quick smoke break. I haven't smoked in years, but in this line of work, kind of makes you miss it. I took a long drag of the cigarette and let the smoke sit in my lungs for a second before expelling it. My head felt fuzzy from the sudden rush of nicotine. Leaned down to put the ciggy out, but was stopped by the strange man. His body once again quivered underneath the coat. His teeth clicked together as he sniffed the air.
Mind if I join you?
The man squeaked out. He shuffled in next to me with an arm out, almost as if he was blind. I furrowed my brow and used my own hand to guide him.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We stood in silence for a minute as I tried to think up a way to ask him what kind of monster he was, without sounding rude or weird.
You're wondering what I am, aren't you?
He asked. I looked at him and nodded my head. It's not every day I see someone like you. And the man chuckled as he lit a ciggy and took a long drag. He shook under the coat again and motioned towards the tavern.
Mind if we talk inside? It's getting chillier by the day.
I nodded my head and watched as he walked to the front of the tavern. I put out my cigarette and walked inside. He sat at the same stool as before, his Bloody Mary almost empty. Got started on another one for him as he started to tell me how he broke a witch's heart.
Phoebe was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Her hair like honey, and her skin like porcelain. The way the sun hit her face and the way her eyes lit up as she smiled.
He let out a pained sigh and took another long drag out of his cigarette before he continued.
Then one day I woke up like this.
Man removed his hat to reveal his mole rat face. I felt a pang of guilt as he put his hat back on. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a locket. He opened it and stared at the picture that was inside.
She was beautiful, but I didn't deserve her.
He placed the locket onto the counter, leaned forward and had a peek at the picture. It was a honey blonde-haired woman. She had the widest smile and her eyes did seem to light up.
I think it's about time I let go,
the man said. He then asked me if I wanted to hang on to the locket for him. I knew what he was up to. The guy wanted me to take the locket because it's cursed. We get guys like him every once in a while, cursed by witches. Oh, look, sorry mate, but employees aren't allowed to take items or personal belongings from customers. I left him with that and went out for another smoke break. Damien stayed behind at the bar. Next thing I know, rushing back inside the tavern to see Stacy behind the bar, her face twisted in horror. I rushed to the front and looked to the floor where Damien laid. Didn't know it was Damien until he spoke. His pink wrinkled skin stretched as he said my name. The stranger, surprise surprise, was nowhere to be seen. His locket clutched in Damien's stupid hand. I kneeled down and stared at his mole rat face and shook my head. Why'd you take the locket, you dickhead? You're not supposed to take anything from anyone. I helped Damien up to his feet, and he shook from the cold. Everyone else in the tavern looked on as I went to the back to grab Damien his coat.
He asked me if I wanted the locket. I didn't say anything since I had another customer to tend to. The next thing I know, he walked out of the tavern, leaving the locket behind.
Damien said, or half fucking sang, as he pulled his coat on and wrapped it around himself tight. Jimmy walked out from his office and shook his head as soon as he saw Damien.
I grabbed the damn thing to give it back to him, but as soon as I grabbed it, I felt this hot, searing pain in my face.
Damien moved his head around and panic had finally set in.
I can't see,
he shouted as he grasped onto my arm and started to touch his face. He let out a pained sob as he continued to feel his face.
I'll see what I can do. But for now, it seems you need to pass that locket on to someone else. Sadly, you can't do that here. It'll be bad for business if I let one of my employees curse a customer.
And the rest of the night I worked the bar alone. Damien quit right then and there. Never touch an object that's been left behind.